What if everything we call civilization, writing, law, the measurement of time itself was not invented in Mesopotamia, but rescued from the ruins of something older? A civilization that shouldn't exist. In southern Mesopotamia around 3500 BC, a civilization appeared that shouldn't exist. No simple villages leading up to it. No trial and error. Just sudden, advanced knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and city planning. The Sumerians themselves claimed they didn't invent any of it. They said it was taught to them by beings who came after a great flood. What if they were telling the truth? Beneath the heat-shimmered air of southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates once carved through fertile plains, clay tablets lie buried in layers of dust and time. Each wedge pressed into wet earth 5,000 years ago was meant to survive. The scribes who made them understood something we're only now beginning to grasp: that knowledge is fragile, that civilization's full, and that memory requires careful preservation. Before we go further into what those tablets reveal, take a moment to subscribe if you're drawn to histories that blur the line between myth and evidence. And if you're listening in the dark, tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is there. I want to imagine this story reaching you across the same distances it's already traveled through time. The discovery that changed everything. The story begins not with a discovery, but with confusion. In the 1840s, European archaeologists arrived in the deserts near ancient Uruk and Eridu. They expected to find simple settlements, the crude beginnings of human society. Instead, their shovels struck something that challenged every theory they carried with them. Tens of thousands of clay tablets emerged from the sand. Not simple scratches, but advanced records of a culture that appeared in the archaeological record already complete. They called this people the Sumerians. And from the moment their tablets were translated, a question began to haunt the scholars who studied them: where did they come from? Because Sumer doesn't behave like other civilizations. There's no archaeological staircase leading up to it. No centuries of slow progress from crude to refined. Around 3500 BC, in the floodplains of southern Mesopotamia, a fully formed writing system simply appears. Cities laid out with geometric precision. Irrigation networks engineered with mathematical accuracy. A BASC 60 numbering system so advanced we still use it to measure minutes, seconds, and the degrees of a circle. It was as if someone had skipped the first 10 chapters and started the story already knowing how it ends. Traditional archaeology has tried to explain this suddenness. Perhaps earlier settlements were washed away by floods, leaving no trace. Perhaps development happened faster than we realize. But the tablets themselves tell a different story. They don't speak of invention and trial and error. They speak of inheritance, of knowledge passed down, of teachings received from figures they called the Anunnaki beings, who descended from heaven to earth after catastrophe swept away an earlier world. Most scholars read these accounts as mythology, poetic metaphors for natural processes or tribal memories. But what if the Sumerians were being precise? What if the beings they remembered as gods were actually the last survivors of a civilization destroyed long before Sumer rose from the mud? The tablets speak. Stand in the British Museum today, and you can see these tablets behind glass. Cuneiform script, wedge-shaped marks that look like bird tracks in clay. Each symbol carries meaning, but together they carry something heavier: urgency. These weren't casual records. They were careful acts of preservation. Lists of kings who ruled before a great flood. Star charts tracking planetary movements. Medical texts describing surgical procedures. Legal codes outlining property rights and marriage contracts. All of it appearing within the first few centuries of Sumer's existence, as though someone was racing to write down everything they still remembered before it was forgotten entirely. One tablet unearthed at Nippur contains a line that stops you cold: after kingship descended from heaven, after the great flood had swept over. Not metaphorically descended. Not symbolically. The scribes wrote it as historical fact that authority, structure, and knowledge came from somewhere else, brought by survivors of a disaster that ended the world before theirs. Imagine holding that tablet, still warm from the Iraqi sun, declare off under your fingertips. The same ridges pressed by hands that lived 5,000 years ago. Hands that might have been taught by elders who remembered an older world. Each mark in the clay is a choice: what to save, what to pass on. What truth must survive even if the people who first knew it cannot. And here's what makes the hair stand up on your neck: Sumer's impossible knowledge isn't just in their myths. It's in their mathematics, their astronomy, their engineering. They tracked the phases of Venus with precision we couldn't verify until modern telescopes. They calculated the orbital periods of Jupiter and Mars. They aligned their temples to celestial coordinates. They built irrigation systems that supported cities of tens of thousands. They smelted bronze, performed surgery, wrote poetry and law, and divided the sky into 360 degrees, based on calculations that require centuries of accumulated observation or access to records from someone who had already done that work. The archaeological mystery. When excavators reached the lowest levels of Uruk, they found city walls stretching 6 miles in circumference. Monumental architecture. Advanced metalworking. A library of over 40,000 tablets documenting trade, astronomy, medicine, and ritual. This wasn't a culture finding its footing. This was a culture that had already found it. How do you learn so much so fast? Where does BASC 60 mathematics come from when every other culture uses base 10? Why do myths describe gods who argue in councils, assign responsibilities, and teach specific technologies, irrigation, metalworking, writing, as though they were engineers, not supernatural beings? The deeper archaeologists dug, the stranger it became. Because beneath Sumer's cities, they found flood layers, thick deposits of sterile silt with no pottery, no tools, no signs of human habitation. Geological scars that matched the timeline. The tablets described a catastrophic deluge that separated the world that came before from the world that came after. The Sumerians called the time before the flood antediluvian. They said kingship had existed for tens of thousands of years before the waters came. They listed rulers with impossibly long reigns, 43,200 years, 28,800 years, spans that seem absurd until you consider that they might be preserving chronologies from a culture that measured time differently, or recording dynasties and eras, rather than individual lives. And then the flood line, sharp, definitive, after which the reigns become humanscaled again. At night, when the museum lights dim and the galleries empty, those tablets rest in climatic-controlled cases, still carrying the breath of the scribes who made them. They're not just artifacts. They're messages, warnings maybe, or farewells. Evidence that someone who came before wanted desperately for someone who came after to know that they had existed. We think of ourselves as the beginning of understanding, the first to measure the stars and map the earth. But what if we're not the first of all? What if we're only the latest in a chain of remembering and forgetting that stretches back through catastrophes we've erased from our own timelines? The Sumerians said their gods came after the flood, that they brought knowledge from heaven to earth, that they restored what was before, not created or stored. And if that's true, if the Anunnaki were not supernatural beings, but survivors of a dead civilization, refugees carrying the last fragments of a world erased by rising waters and climate chaos, then everything changes. Because it means Sumer was never the origin. It was a recovery. So before we ask how Sumer built its cities and calculated the stars, we need to ask a more fundamental question: what exactly happened to the world that came before? And who survived long enough to teach the Sumerians how to rebuild? Understanding what Sumer actually was. To understand what happened to the world before Sumer, we first need to understand what Sumer itself actually was, and why it terrified the archaeologists who found it. The first expeditions into southern Mesopotamia expected to uncover humanity's awkward childhood. They imagined crude huts giving way to simple villages, which over thousands of years might evolve into something resembling civilization. That's how progress was supposed to work: slow, stumbling, and step by step. What they found instead was Uruk. By 3500 BC, Uruk wasn't a village. It was a city of perhaps 50,000 people, larger than most European cities of the time, contained within massive defensive walls that stretched for miles. Inside those walls stood the White Temple, a limestone structure raised on an artificial platform 40 feet high, aligned with cardinal directions, and visible for miles across the flat plains. Nearby, the Ina district contained multiple monumental buildings, courtyards paved with colored stone mosaics, and columns decorated with intricate cone mosaics, thousands of clay cones pressed into walls to create geometric patterns. This wasn't primitive. This was architecture that required understanding of geometry. And Uruk wasn't alone. Eridu, Nippur, Lagash, each city that emerged from the sand, revealed the same pattern: advanced urban planning, sophisticated hydraulic engineering, metalworking workshops producing bronze tools, potter's wheels, spinning vessels of startling uniformity. And everywhere, tablets. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets covered in Egyptian script that no one had seen in over 2,000 years. The language that shouldn't exist. When Henry Rawlinson first began deciphering cuneiform in the 1850s, he started with Akkadian, a Semitic language with relatives he could trace. But beneath the Akkadian texts, older tablets revealed a completely different language. The grammar didn't match. The word order felt alien. The entire structure suggested something unrelated to any known language family. They called it Sumerian. And they realized with growing unease that it was a linguistic orphan, a language with no parent, no siblings, no clear origin. But the real shock came when they translated what the tablets actually said. These weren't experimental writings, crude first attempts at recording thought. They were accounting ledgers tracking complex transactions. Legal contracts specifying property rights and inheritance laws. Medical texts describing surgical procedures for cataracts and broken bones. Astronomical tables calculating the movements of Venus with a precision that wouldn't be matched again until the Renaissance. Mathematical problems using the Pythagorean theorem 1,500 years before Pythagoras was born. One tablet from Nippur, dated to around 2000 BC but copying older Sumerian texts, contains a calculation problem: a reed stands against a wall. If the top slides down 3 cubits, how far does the base slide out? The solution uses what we call the Pythagorean theorem: a superscript 2 plus b superscript 2 equals c superscript 2. The mathematics was already ancient when this scribe copied it. Another tablet tracks the heliacal rising of Venus, the moment when the planet first becomes visible before sunrise after a period of invisibility. The observations are so precise that modern astronomers have used them to date the reign of King Anisetuka of Babylon. But the Babylonians were themselves copying Sumerian astronomical traditions that were already 1,000 years old by their time. The pattern of impossible knowledge. This is the pattern that emerges from every excavation. Sumer arrives knowing things it shouldn't know yet. They divided the circle into 360 degrees. They divided the day into 24 hours, each hour into 60 minutes, each minute into 60 seconds. They measured angles using the same BASC 60 system we still use today. When you check the time or navigate by coordinates, you're using Sumerian mathematics. Why base 60? Most cultures count on their fingers and use base 10. Some use base 20, counting fingers and toes. But 60 is unusual and brilliant. It's divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making complex calculations simpler. It's the kind of system you choose if you'd already tried other methods and found them lacking, or if someone had taught you which one worked best. The archaeologist Leonard Woolley, excavating at Ur in the 1920s, summarized the problem elegantly. The Sumerians were not primitive. They had already passed through those stages which we associate with prehistoric cultures. When we first meet them, they're in full possession of a mature civilization. But where was the prehistory? Where were the centuries of development? In 1929, Woolley dug deeper beneath the royal tombs of Ur 11 feet down. He hit a layer of water-laid clay 8 feet thick, sterile, devoid of any artifacts, the signature of catastrophic flooding. Below that layer, he found pottery and tools from an earlier period. Then another flood layer. And below that, older settlements still. The floods were real. Multiple episodes of massive flooding had repeatedly scoured the valley clean. And the Sumerian tablets spoke of exactly this, a great deluge that marked the boundary between two eras of history. The flood that divided history. The most explicit statement comes from a tablet known as the Eridu Genesis, one of the earliest written versions of the flood story. It describes a time before the flood when kingship was lowered from heaven, and cities were founded by divine decree. Then came the deluge, sent to destroy humanity for reasons the damaged tablet no longer reveals. One man, warned by the god Enki, builds a boat and survives. After the waters recede, the text says, kingship descended from heaven again. That word descended. Not evolved, not invented. Descended. Later Sumerian king lists make the claim even more explicit. They begin with a line that has puzzled scholars for a century. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Then they list rulers Alulim, Alalgar, and Meluanna who reigned for spans of 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. 8 kings ruling for a total of 241,200 years before the flood. Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. And suddenly the reigns become plausible 1,200 years, 960 years still long, but within the realm of dynastic memory. Orthodox scholarship reads this as mythological inflation, symbolic numbers, encoding astronomical cycles of religious significance. And perhaps that's true. But there's another possibility. When the tablets themselves suggest that these weren't Sumerian inventions, but inherited records from an older culture whose chronologies, when translated into Sumerian timekeeping, produced impossible spans. What if the Sumerians were preserving someone else's history? The gods who taught. The tablets speak consistently of knowledge being taught, not discovered. The god Enki, called Lord of the Earth, is credited with organizing civilization, assigning roles and responsibilities, teaching agriculture, writing, and mathematics. The goddess Inanna brings the abstract concepts of civilization, including kingship, priesthood, and craft knowledge from Eridu to Uruk. The Anunnaki, the collective group of deities, are described as those who from heaven to earth came. In every account, knowledge flows downward from sky to earth, from divine teachers to human students. The tone is consistent instruction, not innovation. The Sumer was rebuilding something older. Then what exactly happened to the world that came before? And who survived to tell them how to begin again? The answer lies not in Mesopotamia alone, but in the collective memory of humanity itself. Because the flood story doesn't belong only to Sumer. It belongs to everyone. The universal flood memory. The Sumerian version, preserved in fragments from texts like the Eridu Genesis and later in the Epic of Gilgamesh, tells of Sudra, a pious king warned by the god Enki, that the other deities plan to destroy humanity with a great deluge. Enki instructs Sudra to build a massive boat, seal it with bitumen, and take aboard the seed of all living things. The flood comes. For 7 days and nights, the storm rages. When the waters finally recede, Sudra offers sacrifice, and the gods grant him eternal life. The Akkadians, who absorbed Sumerian culture, told the same story with a different name, Utnapishtim. The Hebrews called him Noah. But the narrative structure remains hauntingly consistent. In the Hindu Matsya Purana, the god Vishnu warns Manu of a coming flood that will destroy all life. Manu builds a boat, ties it to the horn of a great fish, and rides out the deluge. In Greek mythology, Zeus sends a flood to cleanse the earth of the Bronze race's wickedness. Deucalion and Per survive in a chest, landing on Mount Parnassus when the waters subside. The Aztecs spoke of Nahuatl, Forewater, a world age ended by catastrophic flooding, with only 2 humans surviving to repopulate the earth. Moved to China the Great Flood of Gun, requiring generations of engineering to control. To India Dravidian flood myths predating the Hindu texts. To Australia Aboriginal stories of the sea rising and swallowing coastal lands. To the Pacific Polynesian legends of islands sinking beneath the waves. The pattern repeats across every inhabited continent, an advanced or prosperous age, growing corruption or divine displeasure, a warning given to one righteous person, a vessel constructed, catastrophic waters, survival of a remnant, renewal of the world. The skeptical explanation has always been that floods are common. Every river valley civilization experiences them, so naturally they feature in mythology. But this dismissal ignores the specificity of the parallels. These aren't just stories about seasonal flooding or local disasters. They describe world-ending cataclysms, planetary resets, the drowning of an entire previous age. What if the reason these stories sound the same is because they're describing the same thing? The geological evidence. Around 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, something catastrophic happened to Earth's climate. The geological record preserves it in stark detail. For nearly 100,000 years, massive ice sheets had covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia. At their peak, these glaciers were 2 miles thick, locking up so much water that global sea levels sat roughly 400 feet lower than today. The coastlines looked completely different. What we call the English Channel was a river valley. The Persian Gulf was a lush plain. Indonesia's islands formed a continuous landmass. Then, beginning around 14,000 years ago, the ice began to melt. Not gradually, but in pulses, sudden, violent releases of meltwater as ice dams failed and glacial lakes burst. These meltwater pulses, designated by geologists as MWP-1A, MWP-1B, and others, raised sea levels by dozens of feet in mere centuries, sometimes in mere decades. The most dramatic event, MWP-1A around 14,600 years ago, saw sea levels rise approximately 50 feet in less than 500 years, an average of more than 1 foot per decade. Coastal settlements would have watched the ocean advance month by month, year by year, swallowing everything humans had built near the water's edge. And humans have always built near the water. Where civilization emerges. Consider where civilization emerges when we first see it archaeologically: river valleys, coasts, deltas. Water means transportation, irrigation, fish, trade. Every major early culture we know arose beside water. Why would earlier peoples have been any different? If a sophisticated culture existed during the Ice Age, taking advantage of those expanded coastal plains, those broad river valleys that are now underwater, the rising seas would have systematically erased it. Their cities would be under 400 feet of ocean. Their ports, submerged. Their agricultural zones, drowned. Their temples and libraries and workshops now buried beneath layers of marine sediment off the continental shelves. Only the inland settlements, the highland refuges, might have survived, and only there would any trace of them remain. The evidence for catastrophic flooding extends beyond rising seas. In Mesopotamia itself, archaeologists have found precisely what the myths describe: sudden destruction layers. At Shurapak, the city where the Sumerian flood heroes Isutter was said to rule, excavations revealed a thick deposit of water-laid clay, separating older occupation layers from later ones. At Leonard Woolley found his 8-foot flood layer. At Kish, another sterile silt deposit. These weren't annual river floods. They were events violent enough to bury entire settlements and force survivors to start again. The Black Sea Deluge. Some researchers point to the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis. Around 5600 BC, according to this theory, the Mediterranean broke through the Bosphorus barrier and flooded into what had been a freshwater lake, raising the Black Sea's level by hundreds of feet and swallowing thousands of square miles of inhabited coastline virtually overnight. Underwater archaeology has found preserved shorelines, structures, and even ancient beaches now submerged far below the surface. Others look further back to the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Around 10,800 BC, something possibly comet fragment struck the North American ice sheet, triggering rapid melting, massive wildfires, and a sudden return to Ice Age conditions that lasted 1,200 years. The impact evidence remains controversial, but the climate chaos it supposedly triggered is not. Ice cores and sediment records worldwide show a dramatic temperature crash, followed by rapid warming, all within a few human generations. Whether from impact, ice dam collapse, or gradual melt acceleration, the result was the same: the world humans had known for thousands of years was drowning. The survivors. Now imagine you're part of a culture living on those doomed coastlines. Your cities have thrived for generations on the shores of what will become the Persian Gulf. You've developed agriculture, architecture, astronomical observation, navigation. You've built libraries and temples. You've mapped the stars and calculated the seasons. You've created systems of law and governance. And then the water comes. Not in a single week, as the myths compress it, but across decades and centuries. Relentless, unstoppable, erasing everything you've built. Your grandparents spoke of the shore being there. Your parents watched it move inland. You watch your children abandon the coastal cities entirely, retreating to higher ground, carrying what knowledge they can preserve, leaving behind everything too heavy to move. Most of your culture dies. Most of your people die. The vast infrastructure that supported your civilization, the ports, the trade networks, the agricultural zones, all gone beneath the waves. But some survive. Those in the highlands. Those who moved inland early. Those who had the foresight or luck to be somewhere the water couldn't reach. And they remember. They remember the cities beneath the waves. They remember the technologies and systems that once existed. They remember the knowledge accumulated over centuries. And when they encounter the scattered populations who survived in the interior, people who never had cities, who never learned writing, who still lived in the old ways, the survivors would seem like something more than human. They would seem like gods descending from a lost heaven. The trauma line. For Sumerian storytellers, the flood wasn't just divine anger. It was the trauma line separating everything before from everything after, the boundary between the world that knew and the world that forgot. If the flood was the line between two worlds, can we find traces of the people who stood on both sides of that line? And did Sumer remember them as gods? The King List. The most unsettling document ever recovered from ancient Mesopotamia isn't a myth or a poem. It's a list. In 1906, Hermann Helpert was excavating at Nippur when his team unearthed a clay prism roughly 8 inches tall, covered on all 4 sides with dense cuneiform script. Similar fragments have been found at Larsa, and other Sumerian sites, but this prism, designated WB62, was the most complete version yet discovered. When Helpert began translating it, he realized he was holding something that shouldn't exist, a comprehensive chronology of kingship, stretching back to a time before cities, before writing, before what we call history. It's known today as the Sumerian King List. The document begins with a statement so matter-of-fact it could be a census record. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Then it names the first king Alulum. And beside his name, a number 28,800 years. The second king, Alalgar, ruled for 36,000 years. The third, Imeluana, reigned for 43,200 years. 5 cities are listed before the flood: Eridu, Batabir, Larag, Sippar, and Shurapak. Each governed by kings whose reigns spanned tens of thousands of years. 8 kings in total, ruling for a combined 241,200 years. And then, cutting through the chronology like a knife, then the flood swept over. After that single line, everything changes. The King List resumes, but the reigns have collapsed into something recognizable: 1,200 years, 960 years, 625 years, still impossibly long by modern standards, but no longer astronomical. These are numbers that feel like dynastic memory, exaggerated perhaps, but rooted in something that could have actually happened. The scholarly debate. The contrast is so stark that for over a century, scholars have struggled to explain it. The orthodox interpretation treats the pre-flood section as pure mythology, symbolic numbers, encoding astronomical cycles or numerological significance. The number 43,200, for instance, can be derived from BASC 60 calculations involving planetary periods. In Mesopotamian cosmology, numbers had sacred meanings, and these impossibly long reigns might represent ritual time, rather than historical time. This explanation is tidy. It's safe. It allows us to dismiss the pre-flood kings as poetic devices, while treating the post-flood sections as distorted but genuine history. But it doesn't explain why the Sumerians themselves treated the entire document as a continuous historical record. The King List doesn't mark any distinction in tone or style between the pre-flood and post-flood sections. There's no shift into metaphorical language. No signal that the reader should suddenly start interpreting the numbers symbolically. The format is identical throughout: city name, king's name, length of reign, next king. It's presented as fact. The King List also isn't alone. Multiple copies and fragments have been found across Mesopotamia, each version showing minor variations, but maintaining the same essential structure. This wasn't a single scribe's fantasy. It was a standardized historical document, copied and preserved across generations, treated with the same authority as any other royal chronicle. Taking it seriously. So what if we take it seriously? Not literally. 28,800 years is clearly not a human lifespan, but seriously. What if the Sumerians were trying to preserve something real, and we're simply not reading it correctly? One possibility is calendrical translation errors. If the pre-flood civilization used a different system for measuring time, perhaps lunar months instead of solar years, or ritual cycles tied to planetary movements, their chronologies would become wildly inflated when later scribes attempted to convert them into Sumerian years. A reign of 480 months would become 40 years in lunar reckoning. But if a later scribe mistakenly read it as 480 years, the error compounds across generations of copying. Mathematical conversions between different base systems, especially base 60, can produce exactly these kinds of multiplied values. But there's another interpretation that fits the survivor hypothesis even more precisely. What if these aren't individual kings at all, but dynasties, eras, or entire genealogical lines? In many oral cultures, ancestral memory compresses multiple generations into single representative figures. A king who ruled for 28,800 years might represent an entire royal lineage spanning thousands of years, a continuous political entity, remembered under a single name. The pre-flood section then would be a compressed chronicle of an older civilization's deep history, preserved by survivors who no longer had access to the detailed records, but remembered the broad outlines. These cities existed, these powers ruled, this much time passed. Memory across catastrophe. Think of how we use phrases like the Roman Empire lasted 500 years, or the Egyptian Old Kingdom spanned centuries. We're compressing complex histories into manageable summaries. Now imagine trying to preserve that kind of generational memory through an apocalyptic event, through displacement and cultural disruption, through translation into a new language with a different calendrical system. The details would blur. The numbers would stretch. But the skeleton of the history, the succession of powers, the names of cities, the fact that immense time past might survive. The king list itself hints at this interpretation. The kings aren't described as immortal beings or supernatural entities. They're simply listed alongside their cities and their reigns, doing what kings do: ruling, building, organizing. There's no explanation offered for their longevity. No claim that they were divine. The document presents them as a presence every other king as political authorities within a continuous historical framework. And then there's that line, then the flood swept over. In the Well-Blundell Prism, the most complete version of the king list, those words appear after the 8th pre-flood king, Ubartudu of Shuruppak. The text then states, after the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Notice that phrase again: descended from heaven. Not began, or emerged, or was established. Descended, as if kingship itself, the concept of organized political authority, had to be brought down again, reintroduced, taught anew to populations that had forgotten or never known it. Post-flood continuity. The city of Kish becomes the first post-flood seat of power. And its early kings still have impossibly long reigns: 1,200 years, 960 years. But these numbers fall within the range of exaggerated dynastic memory. They feel like the inflation we see in other ancient king lists, where reigns are extended to fill the gap between known historical events and mythical origins. But then, as the list moves forward in time, the reigns gradually normalize. By the time we reach the historical period kings we can verify through archaeological evidence and contemporary inscriptions, the king list becomes remarkably accurate. The third dynasty of Ur, for instance, matches archaeological findings with precision. The document transforms from myth to history with no clear boundary, suggesting that even the mythical sections might contain historical kernels we're not recognizing. The archaeologist Thorkel Jacobsen spent decades studying the king list and concluded that it represents genuine tradition, not invention. Even the pre-flood section, he argued, reflects authentic cultural memory, not of individual lifespans, but a political continuity stretching back into the deep past, far beyond the founding of Sumer itself. What the king list really tells us. If Jacobsen is right, then the pre-flood kings aren't fantasies. They're the fading shadows of real political entities from an older world, their histories distorted by time and catastrophe, but not entirely erased. The survivors who brought their knowledge to Sumer also brought their chronologies, their royal genealogies, their sense of belonging to a political tradition that stretched back through unimaginable spans of time. The flood then isn't just a natural disaster in the king list. It's a historical pivot, the moment when one world's continuity was broken and another world's continuity began. The sharp division between pre-flood and post-flood reigns marks the difference between inherited memory and lived experience. Those who came after the flood were starting fresh, building new dynasties, creating new cities. But they knew because survivors told them that kingship itself was older, that cities had existed before, that the systems they were learning had been practiced for epochs beyond counting. And perhaps most revealing, they felt compelled to write it all down. The Sumerians didn't begin their king lists with the founding of Ur. They began it with Eridu and Alulim, 241,200 years before their own time. Because even if they didn't fully understand the chronology, they knew their civilization wasn't the first. They were heirs to something ancient, and that knowledge was too important to lose again. The evidence in stone. If the king list preserves the memory of rulers from a dead civilization, where else in the ancient world do we see signs that someone older had already measured time? The answer was buried under a hill in southeastern Turkey, waiting for someone to recognize it for what it was. In 1963, a survey team from the University of Chicago noticed something odd about a mound called Göbekli Tepe Hill in Turkish. Scattered across its surface were work stones and flint tools, signs of ancient human activity. The surveyors noted it and moved on, assuming it was just another modest Neolithic settlement, probably a medieval cemetery. They were wrong by about 11,000 years. When German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating Göbekli Tepe in 1995, he uncovered something that should not exist. Beneath the soil, arranged in carefully planned circles, stood massive shaped limestone pillars some nearly 20 feet tall and weighing up to 20 tons. The pillars were decorated with intricate bas-relief carvings: foxes, lions, bulls, snakes, scorpions, spiders, and birds. Abstract symbols were carved into the stone: crescents, circles, shaped forms that might represent human figures or cosmic diagrams. And then came the radiocarbon dates: 9600 BC. Some structures possibly older. This wasn't just before Sumer. It was before agriculture, before pottery, before permanent settlements, before everything we thought was necessary for monumental architecture. According to conventional timelines, the people who built Göbekli Tepe should have been small bands of hunter-gatherers struggling to survive, with no capacity for organized labor or complex symbolic systems. Yet here stood proof of sophisticated engineering, astronomical alignment, and shared religious or cosmological beliefs more than 6,000 years before the first Sumerian city. The paradox of Göbekli Tepe. The paradox is absolute. Göbekli Tepe rewrites the story of civilization by simply existing. The site consists of at least 20 circular enclosures, each between 30 and 100 feet in diameter, though only a fraction have been excavated. The pillars are precisely quarried and shaped, requiring knowledge of stonework techniques, leverage systems, and presumably some form of organized workforce. Moving a 20-ton pillar without metal tools, wheels, or draft animals suggests not just strength but planning, knowledge of physics, coordination of labor, probably some form of social hierarchy to organize the effort. And the carvings aren't random decorations. They show selectivity, repetition, intention. Certain animals appear again and again. Snakes are everywhere, often paired with other creatures. The cheap pillars themselves have been interpreted as stylized human forms, arms carved at their sides, belts around their centers, suggesting anthropomorphic representations, possibly ancestors or deities. Most striking are the astronomical alignments. Several enclosures are oriented to cardinal directions or to the rising and setting points of specific stars. One pillar appears to depict constellations: a scorpion corresponding to Scorpius, a vulture to what we call Cygnus, possibly a bull representing Taurus. Researcher Andrew Collins and others have suggested these aren't just animal totems, but a star map of cosmology carved in stone. If true, it means people in 9600 BC weren't just surviving, they were measuring the heavens. A wider pattern. Göbekli Tepe isn't alone. Across the Fertile Crescent, other sites reveal unexpected sophistication in the pre-pottery Neolithic period. At Catalhoyuk in central Turkey, dated to around 7500 BC, archaeologists found a settlement of perhaps 8,000 people living in mud brick houses packed so tightly that residents entered through roof openings. Inside, the walls were covered with elaborate murals, geometric patterns, hunting scenes, possibly early maps. The dead were buried beneath the floors, and the site shows evidence of trade networks stretching hundreds of miles. At Jericho in the Jordan Valley, dated to around 9000 BC, a massive stone tower rises 28 feet high, built with precisely shaped stones and an interior staircase. No one knows its purpose. Defense seems unlikely, given the effort required, but it demonstrates organizational capacity and architectural knowledge, far earlier than expected. These sites paint a picture of the pre-agricultural world that contradicts everything we assumed. These weren't simple foragers waiting for someone to invent farming. They were complex societies with symbolic systems, shared beliefs, trade networks, and monumental architecture. And they predate Sumer by millennia. What this means for the survivor hypothesis. Now consider what this means for the survivor hypothesis. If catastrophic flooding and climate change at the end of the Ice Age destroyed a coastal civilization around 12,000 to 10,000 BC, the survivors wouldn't have vanished. They would have moved inland, into the highlands, away from the rising waters. Places like southeastern Turkey, elevated, stable, with access to resources, would have been ideal refuges. Göbekli Tepe sits on a limestone plateau, high and dry, overlooking the plains where agriculture would later emerge. Its builders chose this location deliberately, investing enormous effort to create something permanent, something sacred. What if Göbekli Tepe wasn't the beginning of monumental architecture, but a continuation? A tradition carried inland by people who remembered building in stone, who remembered aligning structures with the stars, who remembered that knowledge must be preserved in forms that outlast individual lives. The architectural and symbolic continuities are striking. The circular enclosures at Göbekli Tepe echo patterns found later in Sumerian temple complexes. The emphasis on celestial alignment continues through Mesopotamian ziggurats. The use of repeated animal symbolism, particularly snakes, bulls, and birds, persists across millennia into Sumerian mythology. The Anunnaki are often depicted with bird-like features. Enki's symbol is the serpent. The bull of heaven appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh. These aren't proof of direct transmission, but they suggest a continuity of thought, an unbroken tradition of sacred architecture and cosmic symbolism, stretching from the pre-pottery Neolithic through the rise of Sumer. Knowledge doesn't disappear instantly. Here's the critical insight: knowledge doesn't disappear instantaneously when a civilization collapses. It lingers in the survivors. It degrades, fragments, transforms, but elements persist, especially sacred knowledge, the kind preserved by priesthoods and passed through initiation. The Göbekli Tepe's builders possessed sophisticated understanding of astronomy, engineering, and symbolic representation, and if their descendants migrated southward as climate shifted and populations grew, they would have carried those traditions with them. By the time we see Sumer emerging in the archaeological record around 3500 BC, we're not witnessing the invention of these concepts. We're seeing them re-emerge in written form after thousands of years of oral transmission. The gods who descended after the flood might have been the inheritors of Göbekli Tepe's tradition priestly lineages, who still remembered the old alignments, the old symbols, the old ways of measuring the cosmos and organizing sacred space. Schmidt himself noted that Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried around 8000 BC. Someone carefully filled in the enclosures with soil, preserving them perfectly as though the site had fulfilled its purpose and needed to be protected. Why bury something so laboriously constructed unless the knowledge it represented had already been transmitted, recorded elsewhere, passed on to those who would carry it forward? Perhaps Göbekli Tepe wasn't abandoned. Perhaps it was archived. The knowledge keepers, the flung-lost architects were already carving the sky into stone 7,000 years before Sumer. How did their knowledge travel across the millennia and end up in the hands of Sumer's gods? The Anunnaki gods are governors. The strangest thing about Sumer's gods is how ungodlike they are. When most people imagine ancient deities, they picture distant, transcendent beings, omnipotent forces dwelling beyond human comprehension. But the Anunnaki don't behave that way. They argue in council meetings. They compete for authority. They make mistakes, harbor grudges, and change their minds. They travel between cities by boat and on foot. They build structures, establish laws, and teach specific technologies to specific populations. Read the myths closely, and they sound less like theology and more like political history. The term Anunnaki itself is revealing. It translates roughly as those who from heaven to earth came or the princely offspring, depending on how you parse the Sumerian grammar. In the earliest texts, they're described not as a pantheon of diverse gods, but as a collective group numbered beings, often 50, or 7, or 12, depending on the context. Later Babylonian texts call them the great gods or the judges of fate, but the Sumerian sources treat them more pragmatically as administrators of the world, each with specific responsibilities. Organizing, not creating. The most telling myths are the organizational ones, texts that describe the Anunnaki not creating the world from nothing, but ordering it, arranging it, assigning functions to things that already exist. In the myth Enki and the world order, the god Enki, called the Lord of the Earth, travels across Sumer assigning roles and domains. He doesn't create the rivers, he establishes their courses. He doesn't invent farming, he appoints the goddess Ashnan to oversee grain production. He doesn't bring metalworking into being, he designates the smith god to manage it. The entire text reads like an administrative reorganization, a divine bureaucrat, ensuring every trade, every craft, every natural resource has an overseer. Why would a creator god need to organize what he supposedly created? Unless he wasn't creating it all. Unless he was restoring systems that had existed before and been disrupted. Enki appears throughout Sumerian literature as the keeper of knowledge. He possesses the mere abstract concepts or divine powers including kingship, priesthood, craftsmanship, music, and writing, and guards them in his temple at Eridu. In one myth, the goddess Inanna tricks Enki into giving her the me while he's drunk, and she transports them to her city of Uruk. Enki sends his servants to retrieve them, but Inanna successfully establishes the me in her own domain. This isn't a story about cosmic creation. It's a story about the transfer of knowledge and authority between political centers, told through divine metaphor. Political conflicts among gods. Then there's Enlil, often described as the king of the gods, ruler of the air and storms. In the flood narrative preserved in texts like Atrahasis, Enlil becomes frustrated with humanity's noise and commotion, and decides to destroy them with a deluge. But Enki, acting against Enlil's decree, secretly warns the human Atrahasis, or Isudra, depending on the version, to build a boat and survive. The conflict is intensely political. Enlil represents one faction. Enki represents another. Neither is omnipotent. Enki must work around Enlil's authority rather than simply overriding it. And crucially, Enki's warning suggests experience. He knows what's coming because he's seen floods before, or because he understands the patterns that lead to them. After the flood, when Enlil discovers that humans survived, he's initially enraged. But eventually he relents and grants the survivors a place in the new order. The resolution feels negotiated, diplomatic, like a council reaching compromise after disaster. Compare this to later monotheistic traditions where God acts with absolute authority and unchanging will. The Anunnaki don't work that way. They collaborate, compete, and occasionally subvert each other's plans. They feel more like a governing elite than omnipotent beings. Inanna, divine ambition. The goddess Inanna adds another dimension. In myths like her descent to the underworld, she displays pride, ambition, and vulnerability. She wears specific garments and jewelry, each piece representing power and authority. When she descends to visit her sister Reshkigal in the underworld, she's stripped of these items one by one at each gate, arriving naked and powerless. Shita Eyes is resurrected through Enki's intervention, and returns changed. These aren't abstract theological concepts. They're intensely human emotional journeys dressed in mythological language. What this suggests. Now consider what this portrayal suggests about the Anunnaki's origins. Imagine a scenario: a catastrophic event destroys an advanced coastal civilization. Most perish, but a small group survives, perhaps priests, administrators, engineers, those with specialized knowledge. They possess technologies the scattered inland populations don't have: sophisticated agriculture techniques, astronomical knowledge, architectural skills, metalworking, early writing systems for record keeping. When these survivors make contact with Neolithic communities, the contrast would be stark. The survivors could predict seasons using star observations. They could design irrigation systems. They could create bronze tools. They would carry generational memory of cities, laws, organized society, things the post-cataclysm populations had never experienced or had forgotten. To those populations, these abilities would appear miraculous. The survivors wouldn't need to claim divinity. It would be attributed to them. And here's the key: if these survivors came from a hierarchical culture, they would naturally organize themselves as an elite class. They would establish councils, assign responsibilities, compete for influence exactly as the Anunnaki do in the myths. They would be custodians of old knowledge rather than creators of new knowledge, which is precisely how the texts portray them. Teaching, not revelation. The teaching narratives reinforce this pattern. The Anunnaki don't reveal knowledge through mystical means. They instruct, demonstrate, and establish institutions. Enki teaches the craft of irrigation by literally showing people how to dig channels. The mere transferred physically carried from city to city. Temple schools, Idaba, are established where scribes learn writing through repetition and practice, not divine revelation. This is how cultural transmission actually works among human populations. It's how surviving knowledge would be passed from an older culture to a newer one. The Anunnaki even have specific residences. Enlil's temple is in Nippur. Enki's is in Eridu. Inanna's is in Uruk. They don't dwell in abstract heavens. They live in particular cities, maintain specific temples, and their priests serve them in precisely defined roles. These are geographically rooted beings with localized authority. Later traditions transformed the Anunnaki into distant spiritual entities. But the earliest Sumerian texts present them differently: as political actors, technological experts, and organizational leaders who shape the world not through miracles, but through knowledge, planning, and institutional authority. If you strip away the divine language and read these texts as cultural memory, a different picture emerges. The Anunnaki begin to look less like gods, and more like the remnants of an older civilization, people who possessed advanced knowledge, organized in hierarchies, competing for influence, and working to rebuild fragments of what they had lost. They look, in other words, like survivors teaching the next generation how to start again. The science of the lost world. The Sumer's gods look and act like an elite remnant of a ruined world. Where can we see the fingerprints of their lost science most clearly? In Sumer's own achievements. 2 languages, 1 script. When European scholars first began deciphering cuneiform in the mid-19th century, they assumed they were reading variations of a single language family. The Wedgeship script appeared across thousands of tablets from Mesopotamia, so naturally it should represent one linguistic tradition, perhaps with dialectal differences. They were wrong in a way that would take decades to unravel. The breakthrough came through the Behistun inscription, a massive rock carving in modern-day Iran, created by the Persian king Darius I, around 520 BC. The same text was inscribed in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. Scholars like Henry Rawlinson used the Persian section, which they could partially read, as a key to unlock the other 2 scripts. Babylonian turned out to be a Semitic language, related to Hebrew and Arabic familiar territory. Its grammar, vocabulary, and structure fit recognizable patterns. Slowly, painstakingly, the cuneiform tablets began yielding their secrets. But then scholars noticed something unsettling. Some tablets, particularly the oldest ones, didn't follow Semitic rules. The word order was wrong. The grammatical markers didn't make sense. Entire passages remained incomprehensible even when the cuneiform signs were correctly identified. It took years to accept the truth: there were 2 languages written in cuneiform. One was Akkadian and its descendants, Babylonian and Assyrian Semitic languages that could be decoded through comparison with known linguistic families. The other was something else entirely. They called it Sumerian. And unlike Akkadian, Sumerian had no linguistic relatives at all. A language with no family. The language isolate is exactly what it sounds like: a language with no demonstrable connection to any other language family. Basque in Europe is a language isolate. Korean arguably is as well. But these languages exist within modern contexts where we can study them directly. Sumerian, on the other hand, was dead for over 2,000 years before anyone attempted to revive its study. And it appears in the archaeological record already fully formed: no parent language, no evolutionary ancestors, no Proto-Sumerian tablets showing a simpler, earlier version. The oldest Sumerian texts, dated to around 3200 BC, are already sophisticated. They use a complex agglutinative structure, where meaning is built by stacking morphemes, individual units of meaning, onto root words. A single Sumerian word can encode what would require an entire sentence in English. Take the word egala, which breaks down as house plus gal, big plus law, locative suffix equals, in the palace. But the structure allows for extraordinary precision. By changing suffixes, you can specify not just location but direction of movement, possession, agency, time, and relationship all within a single word. This isn't a primitive system. This is linguistic engineering, a highly refined method of encoding complex information efficiently. And it appears in the earliest texts without any obvious developmental stages. Alien grammar. The grammar is equally alien to anyone familiar with Indo-European or Semitic languages. Sumerian is ergative-absolutive rather than nominative-accusative, meaning it treats the subjects of transitive and intransitive verbs differently in ways that feel deeply counterintuitive to English speakers. The verb typically comes last in the sentence. Modifiers follow what they modify. Possessives are marked with suffixes that attach to the possessed object, not the possessor. It's so structurally different from Akkadian that bilingual scribes in later periods had to create word-by-word translation guides, lexical lists, pairing Sumerian terms with Akkadian equivalents because the languages couldn't be translated naturally. They don't map onto each other. Linguists have searched for connections. Some proposed links to Uralic languages, Finnish, Hungarian. Others suggested connections to Dravidian languages in India or to various Caucasian languages. A few even speculated about ties to distant language families in Africa or Central Asia. None have held up to rigorous scrutiny. Sumerian remains stubbornly isolated, a linguistic orphan with no demonstrable family. What language isolation means. Now, here's where it becomes relevant to the survivor hypothesis. Language isolates typically indicate one of two things: either the language evolved in extreme geographic isolation, or it's the last survivor of a Onsologir language family whose other members have vanished. Given Mesopotamia's position at the crossroads of multiple migration routes and trade networks, extreme isolation seems unlikely. Which suggests the second option, Sumerian, is the remnant of a larger linguistic family that no longer exists. But where did that family come from? And why does Sumerian appear in the record already complex, with no visible precursor? Language during collapse. Consider what happens to languages during catastrophic population collapse. When a culture is devastated by disease, climate disaster, or invasion, languages can die within a single generation. If only a small remnant survives, they might preserve their language, artificially teaching it deliberately to their children, even if the surrounding population speaks something different, because the language carries identity, ritual, knowledge, and cultural memory. Now imagine survivors of a coastal civilization displaced by flooding. They move inland, encountering Neolithic populations speaking entirely different languages. The survivors are few, perhaps a few hundred, perhaps a few thousand, but they possess knowledge the local populations lack. They establish themselves as an elite class, a priesthood, a governing authority. They would need to preserve their language because embedded within it is the framework of their knowledge, technical terms for astronomical observations, mathematical concepts, legal formulations, ritual instructions, religious narratives. The language itself becomes a container for everything they're trying not to lose. And so they teach it carefully, within temple schools. They create standardized texts. They develop writing specifically to freeze the language in place, to prevent it from drifting and changing, as spoken languages naturally do. This is exactly what we see in Sumer. The scribal schools. The institution of the Dubba, the tablet house or scribal school, was central to Sumerian culture. Boys, and possibly some girls, though evidence is limited, from elite families spent years learning to read and write Sumerian, copying literary texts, mathematical tables, legal formulas, and religious hymns. The curriculum was rigid, standardized across cities, designed to reproduce exact forms rather than encourage innovation. Surviving school tablets show students copying the same proverbs, the same myths, the same mathematical exercises that their predecessors had copied centuries earlier. This wasn't education for communication. Most daily business in Sumer was already conducted in Akkadian by 2500 BC. This was education for preservation. By the time of the Old Babylonian period, roughly 20,000,1600 BC, Sumerian was effectively dead as a spoken language. Yet the scribal schools continued teaching it for another 1,000 years. Babylonian and Assyrian scholars treated Sumerian the way medieval Europeans treated Latin, as a sacred archaic language that connected them to ancient wisdom. Why preserve a dead language? Why preserve a dead language so meticulously unless that language contains something irreplaceable? The Babylonian king Ashurbanipal, who ruled in the 7th century BC, collected thousands of tablets for his library at Nineveh. Many were Sumerian texts, copied with colophons stating tablet of title, from the original, collated and checked. Some colophons add, whoever removes this tablet, may assure and Belad overthrow him. These weren't casual copies. There were deliberate acts of cultural preservation, conducted more than 1,500 years after Sumerian had ceased to be spoken, by people who understood that the tablets contained knowledge worth protecting. The linguist Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent his career studying Sumerian literature, noted that the language's isolation makes it uniquely difficult to understand. Without related languages for comparison, every translation involves educated guessing. Yet the Sumerians themselves must have spoken it fluently, composed poetry in it, argued legal cases in it, taught complex mathematics through it. How does a language that's sophisticated simply appear with no ancestors unless it didn't appear in Mesopotamia? Unless it was brought there, fully formed, by a population that had already been speaking it for centuries or millennia elsewhere, somewhere now lost beneath rising seas or wrote it into dust. The survivor hypothesis explains it. The survivor hypothesis offers an explanation. Sumerian is the preserved language of the pre-flood civilization's elite. When catastrophe struck and the survivors fled inland, they carried their language with them as refugees carried their most precious possessions. They taught it to their children, and eventually to the populations they encountered, not as a gift, but as a necessity, because embedded within Sumerians' agglutinative structure and alien grammar was the encoded knowledge of a lost world. And when those survivors finally established permanent settlements in Mesopotamia, when they built their temples and ziggurats and irrigation networks, they immediately created schools to ensure the language would never die. Because if the language died, the last link to everything that came before would be severed. The language became a monument more enduring than stone, a living fossil preserving not just words, but the cognitive framework of a vanished culture. Measuring the cosmos. If even the language of Sumer feels like a relic from somewhere else, what does that say about the knowledge that language was used to preserve, especially the knowledge of the heavens? What they already knew. The most revealing thing about Sumerian astronomy isn't what they discovered, it's what they already knew. When archaeologists began translating astronomical tablets from Mesopotamia, they expected to find rudimentary observations, crude attempts to make sense of the night sky. Instead, they found sophisticated mathematical tables, precise planetary cycles, and predictions of celestial events calculated centuries in advance. The famous Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, dating to the Old Babylonian period around 1600 BC but copying older Sumerian observations, tracks the appearances and disappearances of Venus with extraordinary precision. It records on the 15th day of the month, Venus disappeared in the east. For 3 days it remained absent from the sky. On the 18th day, Venus appeared in the west. This isn't casual stargazing. This is systematic data collection tracking the synodic period of Venus, the 584-day cycle, during which the planet goes through its phases of visibility and invisibility as seen from Earth. To recognize this pattern requires decades of continuous observation, meticulous record-keeping, and mathematical analysis. And the Venus observations are just the beginning. Advanced astronomical knowledge. Mesopotamian astronomers tracked Jupiter's 12-year orbital period, dividing the zodiac into 12 sections based on the planet's movement. They calculated Mars' 780-day synodic period. They predicted lunar and solar eclipses using the Saros cycle, a period of approximately 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours, after which eclipses repeat in similar patterns. The Saros cycle is particularly revealing. To discover it, you need to observe and record eclipses over multiple generations, then recognize the pattern mathematically. It's not something a single astronomer could notice in a lifetime. It requires institutional memory, preserved records, and the understanding that astronomical phenomena follow predictable laws. These weren't primitive attempts at understanding. These were mature scientific systems, and they appear in the earliest strata of Mesopotamian civilization already operational. The ASC 60, Mathematics. The mathematical framework underlying these observations is equally sophisticated. The Sumerians divided the circle into 360 degrees, a number derived from the BASC 60 system that permeates all Mesopotamian mathematics. Why 360 and 60? Because it's approximately the number of days in a year, and because it's divisible by an extraordinary number of factors: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, 12, 15, 18, 20, 24, 30, 36, 40, 45, 60, 72, 90, 120, and 180. This isn't accidental. It's engineered for computational efficiency, the kind of system you design if you'd already tried other methods and recognized their limitations, or the kind of system you'd inherit from teachers who had refined it over centuries. The BASC 60 system also structures time itself, the day divided into 24 hours, 12 periods times 2, each hour into 60 minutes, each minute into 60 seconds. We still use the Sumerian framework 5,000 years later because it's mathematically elegant and practically useful. But here's what should make you pause. These systems appear fully formed in the earliest texts. There are no tablets showing proto-astronomy, no trial and error calculations, no abandoned methods replaced by better ones. The mathematical tables, the planetary observations, the eclipse predictions, they're already refined when they first appear in writing. It's as if someone arrived in Mesopotamia already knowing how the sky worked. Myth encodes astronomy. The myths themselves hint at this connection between gods and celestial knowledge. The goddess Inanna, whose primary identity is as the goddess of love and war, is explicitly identified with the planet Venus. And her most famous myth, the descent to the underworld, mirrors Venus's astronomical behavior with uncanny precision. In the myth, Inanna descends through 7 gates, removing a piece of her regalia at each gate until she arrives naked and powerless. She dies, remains in the underworld for 3 days, and then is resurrected and returns to the upper world. Compare this to Venus's astronomical cycle. The planet appears as the evening star, gradually descending toward the horizon over months. Then it disappears below the horizon, descends into the underworld and remains invisible for approximately 3 days during inferior conjunction, the moment when Venus passes between Earth and the Sun. Then it reappears as the morning star, rising before dawn. The myth encodes the astronomical phenomenon. Inanna's descent and return is Venus's visibility cycle transformed into narrative. This suggests the Sumerians, or whoever taught them, understood that the movements of celestial bodies followed predictable patterns, and embedded that knowledge into their mythology as a mnemonic device, a way to preserve astronomical data within story. The numbered ones. The Anunnaki themselves are linguistically connected to celestial observation. One interpretation of their name emphasizes numbered ones are those of Anu, Anu being the sky god. In some texts, the Anunnaki are explicitly numbered, the 50 great gods, the 7 who decree fate. These numbers correspond to astronomical cycles and planetary periods. Were the gods actually planets? Or were they people who had mastered planetary observation so thoroughly that they were named after celestial bodies the way we name months after gods, or call someone a star for their brilliance? The connection between divine authority and celestial knowledge appears repeatedly. Priests observe the stars to determine auspicious dates for rituals, military campaigns, agricultural activities. The movements of planets were interpreted as omens, messages from the gods about earthly affairs. Knowledge of the heavens conferred political power because it allowed prediction. And prediction looked like divine insight. But prediction only works if you have centuries of accurate data, precession and deep time. To recognize the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, that causes the position of stars to shift gradually over time, requires observation, spanning at least 720 years, and preferably much longer. Some researchers argue that the Mesopotamians showed awareness of precession, though this remains debated. If true, it would mean they possessed observational records stretching back beyond Sumer's founding, inherited from an earlier tradition. The tablets themselves occasionally hint at this inheritance. Some astronomical texts contain colophons, noting they were copied from older tablets, sometimes described as damaged or fragmentary. The scribes were preserving what remained of even older records that already existed when Sumer began writing. Where did those records come from? Where did those records come from? If a pre-flood civilization had spent centuries mapping the heavens, perhaps for religious reasons, perhaps for calendrical accuracy, perhaps simply out of intellectual curiosity, their astronomical tables would be among the most valuable knowledge survivors could carry. Star positions don't change quickly, except for precession, so ancient observations would remain useful for generations after the original observers perished. The survivors who became Sumer's gods would arrive knowing the sky intimately. They would know when Venus would disappear and reappear. They would know when eclipses were coming. They would know how to divide the year into seasons, how to mark solstices and equinoxes, how to use stellar risings to track time. To populations without that knowledge, such predictions would seem impossible evidence of communion with divine forces. But to the survivors, it would simply be applied science, the practical use of inherited tables and methods. The new keepers. The priests of Sumer, taught by these survivors, would become the new keepers of celestial knowledge. The temple observatories, ziggurats aligned with cardinal directions and stellar risings, would become the new sites of astronomical observation. The clay tablets would become the new medium for recording what had once been recorded elsewhere, in ways now lost. And the gods themselves, fading from living memory into myth, would remain forever associated with the planet's eternal markers in the sky, still following the paths the ancient observers had first mapped thousands of years before Sumer was born. Racing against oblivion. The Sumer's gods arrived already fluent in the language of the stars. What else might they have carried from their dead world into the mudbrick cities of Mesopotamia? The desperation in the colophons. There's a particular kind of desperation that shows up in the colophons, those closing remarks scribes added to the tablets they copied. Written from an ancient tablet, the original of which was damaged. I have written down all that was left to me. May he who comes after understand what I have preserved. These aren't the confident declarations of a civilization secure in its permanence. These are the words of people haunted by lost people who understood intimately that knowledge is fragile, and time is the enemy of memory. Nowhere is this more evident than in the libraries themselves, those deliberate concentrations of clay tablets that functioned as the last defenses against civilizational forgetting. Nippur, the city of knowledge. The city of Nippur is the most revealing case. Unlike Uruk or Babylon, Nippur was never a capital. No kings ruled from its palaces. No armies marched under its banners. Yet for over 2,000 years, Nippur remained the religious and intellectual center of Mesopotamia, revered by every culture that passed through the region. Why? Because Nippur was where the knowledge lived. When archaeologists excavated Nippur's temple complex in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they found over 60,000 tablets and fragments, one of the largest collections ever recovered from ancient Mesopotamia. Legal codes, medical prescriptions, mathematical tables, astronomical observations, hymns to forgotten gods, proverbs, myths, grammatical exercises, lexical lists pairing Sumerian words with Akkadian translations. This wasn't a royal archive documenting the affairs of state. This was a library in the truest sense, a systematic attempt to gather and preserve every form of knowledge the culture possessed. The tablets spanned centuries, with later Babylonian and Assyrian scribes copying Sumerian texts that were already ancient when they transcribed them. The act of copying was itself sacred. Temple schools trained generations of scribes specifically to reproduce these texts faithfully, treating each tablet as a lifeline to understanding that must not be allowed to break. The emotional weight of preservation. But it's the colophons, those brief scribal notes at the end of tablets, that reveal the emotional weight of this work. Some are straightforward: tablet of title, property of temple, copied by scribe's name. But others carry a different tone, collated with the original and checked. This implies concern about accuracy, about drift and error. From an old tablet whose script was difficult to read. This acknowledges the decay of older sources, the race against time to capture what remains before it becomes illegible. Most poignant are the notes acknowledging loss. The original tablet was broken. I have restored what I could. Or simply, the rest is missing. These aren't just administrative notes. They're confessions of failure, admissions that despite all effort, something irreplaceable has been lost. Survivor psychology. The obsession with preservation makes sense only if you understand it as survivor psychology. Cultures that have experienced catastrophic collapse develop a particular relationship with knowledge. They treat it as existentially precious because they know firsthand how easily entire worlds can vanish. Clay tablets reflect this understanding. Unlike papyrus, which rots in moisture, or leather, which burns, clay is nearly indestructible. The clay tablet survives fire. It actually becomes harder when baked. It survives flooding. Once dried, the text remains readable. It survives time better than almost any other writing medium the ancient world possessed. The choice of clay wasn't just practical, it was strategic. These were people preparing their knowledge to outlast whatever catastrophe might come next. The Library of Nineveh. The library at Nineveh takes this preservation impulse to its logical extreme. In the 7th century BC, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, perhaps the most bibliophilic monarch of the ancient world, ordered the collection and copying of every significant text his agents could find throughout Mesopotamia. His scribes scoured temple libraries in Babylon, Uruk, Nippur, and smaller cities, bringing back texts or making copies of those that couldn't be moved. The resulting library at Nineveh contained over 30,000 tablets covering every domain of knowledge: omens, rituals, medical treatments, astronomical tables, mathematical problems, historical chronicles, myths and epics, including the famous version of the Gilgamesh story. Ashurbanipal's own words, preserved in a colophon, reveal his motivation: I have gathered the scattered texts, and have placed them in my palace for my reading and consideration. But notice that word scattered. By Ashurbanipal's time, Sumerian had been dead as a spoken language for over 1,000 years. The knowledge was fragmenting, spreading across distant temples, at risk of being lost entirely. His library was a rescue operation, an attempt to gather what remained of Sumer's intellectual legacy, before it dispersed beyond recovery. When the Medes and Babylonians sacked Nineveh in 612 BC, the palace burned. But the fire didn't destroy the library. It baked the tablets, hardening them, preserving them. When archaeologists excavated the ruins in the 19th century, they found Ashurbanipal's collection largely intact, buried under collapsed walls and ash. The tablets had outlasted the empire that created them precisely as they were designed to do. What didn't survive? Yet even this monumental preservation effort captured only fragments. Throughout Mesopotamian literature, there are references to texts that no longer exist. The myth of Inanna mentions a work called The Great Below, now lost. Mathematical tables reference problems whose solutions we no longer have. Medical texts cite earlier authorities whose writings have vanished. Astronomical tablets mention older observation records that are now gone. Every recovered tablet points to 10 others that didn't survive. The scribes knew this too. Their colophons sometimes acknowledge gaps in their own knowledge, admitting they're copying texts they don't fully understand because the context has been lost. They preserve the words faithfully even when the meaning has become obscure, trusting that someone in the future might recover what they cannot. The tragedy of forgetting. This is the tragedy at the heart of the preservation effort. Despite everything, despite thousands of tablets, despite centuries of copying, despite the durability of clay, most of the knowledge still disappeared. What we have are fragments, pieces of a larger whole, echoes of texts that once formed a complete intellectual cosmos, but now exist only in scattered, broken form. And if what survived is this fragmentary, imagine what didn't survive at all. Imagine the texts that were never copied because they seemed too common, too familiar, too obvious to need preserving. Imagine the knowledge that was transmitted orally, never written down. Imagine the tablets that were recycled, or lost in unexcavated ruins, or eroded into dust. The libraries of Mesopotamia saved fragments of Sumer's legacy. Those fragments themselves are likely fragments of something older than knowledge the Anunnaki carried from their drowned world. Each act of copying moves the information one step further from its origin, one degree more degraded, one piece more incomplete. Fighting against entropy. The scribes at Nippur and Nineveh understood this. They were fighting a rearguard action against entropy, trying to slow the inevitable decay of memory. They were standing between knowledge and oblivion, knowing they couldn't win, but refusing to stop trying. Clay tablets stacked in dark rooms. Cuneiform wedges pressed into wet earth. Lists and tables and stories and observations. All of it an act of defiance against the certainty of loss. The gods themselves were gone. The survivors who remembered the old world had died generations or centuries earlier. But their systems remained, encoded in these enduring clay archives: how to measure the sky, how to organize a city, how to treat illness, how to calculate areas and volumes, how to maintain order. The tablets were meant to speak across time to whoever came next, to say, this is what we knew. This is what we tried to save. Don't let it disappear again. We are the next generation. The Sumer and its heirs were racing against oblivion to save the last fragments of a dead civilization. What does that make us thousands of years later, when we read their tablets under museum glass? The pattern we can no longer ignore. Step back far enough, and the pattern becomes unmistakable. Around 3500 BC, in the floodplains of southern Mesopotamia, a civilization appears that shouldn't exist yet. No developmental stages leading up to it. No archaeological trail of incremental progress. Just sudden sophistication: writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, urban planning, monumental architecture, all emerging within a few centuries, as if someone had pressed fast forward on human history. The Sumerians themselves don't claim to have invented any of it. Their texts consistently describe knowledge as something received, taught, passed down from the Anunnaki beings who descended from heaven to earth, after a catastrophic flood divided history in two. We've been trained to read these claims as mythology, poetic metaphors for natural processes or cultural memory. But what if the Sumerians were being more literal than we've allowed ourselves to believe? The evidence confirms the narrative. The geological evidence confirms their core narrative. Catastrophic flooding did occur. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose nearly 400 feet as ice sheets melted. Meltwater pulses raised oceans by dozens of feet in mere centuries, drowning coastlines where humans had lived for millennia. Regional floods scoured Mesopotamia, leaving thick, sterile deposits in cities like Ur and Shuruppak, exactly as the tablets describe. If a sophisticated culture existed on those doomed coastlines and human settlements have always clustered near water, the rising seas would have systematically erased it. Their cities would now lie beneath hundreds of feet of ocean. Only inland survivors would remain, carrying fragments of lost knowledge into the interior. The king list records the rupture. The Sumerian king list preserves this rupture explicitly. Before the flood, rulers with impossibly long reigns, 28,800 years, 43,200 years, suggesting either calendrical translation errors or the compression of entire eras and dynasties into single names. Then the flood sweeps over, and suddenly the reigns collapse into plausible spans. The document treats this as continuous history, a single timeline sliced in two by disaster. The chronology points to something older, remembered imperfectly, but remembered nonetheless. Göbekli Tepe proves earlier sophistication. Then there's Göbekli Tepe, dated to 9600 BC, thousands of years before Sumer. It proves that monumental architecture, astronomical alignment, and complex symbolic systems already existed in the pre-pottery Neolithic. Massive carved pillars arranged in circles, decorated with sophisticated animal reliefs, aligned with celestial coordinates, all created by people we've been taught were primitive hunter-gatherers. Göbekli Tepe wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a broader tradition of sacred architecture and cosmic observation that predated cities, farming, and writing. When Sumer emerged 6,000 years later with ziggurats aligned to cardinal directions and temples tracking planetary movements, they weren't inventing these concepts. They were continuing them. The architectural and symbolic continuity suggests an unbroken tradition carried across millennia, perhaps through priestly lineages who preserved the old knowledge, even as civilizations rose and fell around them. The Anunnaki as political actors. Which brings us to the Anunnaki themselves. Read the myths without the filter of later theology, and they don't behave like transcendent deities. They argue in councils. They assign responsibilities. They teach specific technologies: irrigation, metallurgy, writing, mathematics. They compete for authority. They harbor grudges and make mistakes. They behave, in other words, like a governing elite people with specialized knowledge organizing populations that lack that knowledge. If they were survivors of an older civilization, possessing technologies and understanding that scattered post-cataclysm populations didn't have, their abilities would appear miraculous. Their knowledge of astronomy would seem like communion with divine forces. Their architectural skills would look like magic. They wouldn't need to claim godhood. It would be attributed to them. The linguistic orphan. And then there's the language itself. Sumerian is a linguistic orphan, unrelated to any known language family. It appears in the archaeological record already sophisticated, with no visible ancestors. Its agglutinative structure allows extraordinary precision, encoding complex relationships within single words, the kind of linguistic engineering that suggests long refinement. Language isolates typically mean one of two things: extreme geographic isolation, or the last survivor of a vanished language family. Given Mesopotamia's position at global crossroads, isolation seems unlikely. Which leaves the second option: Sumerian is the remnant of a larger linguistic tradition that no longer exists, preserved deliberately by survivors who understood that language carries cultural memory and embedded knowledge. The astronomy points to inheritance. The astronomical and mathematical systems reinforce this pattern. The ASC 60 mathematics. The 360-degree circle. The division of time into hours and minutes. These appear fully operational in the earliest texts, with no developmental stages. The precision of planetary observations, the understanding of eclipse cycles, the tracking of Venus's synodic period all require centuries of accumulated data or access to inherited records. The mythology itself encodes astronomical phenomena. Inanna's descent to the underworld mirrors Venus's visibility cycle. The Anunnaki are called numbered ones, connected to celestial observation. The myths aren't separate from the science. They're mnemonic devices preserving astronomical knowledge within narrative. The libraries reveal survivor psychology. And finally, the libraries, the obsessive preservation effort visible in Nippur and Nineveh. The colophons acknowledging damaged originals and missing texts. The choice of clay as a medium that survives flood and fire. All of this reflects survivor psychology. These are people who know what it means to lose everything, who understand that civilizations can vanish, who are determined not to let it happen again. The alternative explanation. The mainstream explanation for all of this is independent invention. Sumer developed these systems on its own through processes that left no archaeological trace. The flood myths are symbolic. The king list is numerological. The language isolation is coincidence. The astronomical precision is gradual accumulation. This explanation isn't impossible. But it requires us to accept an extraordinary number of coincidences and overlook a consistent pattern pointing in another direction. A simpler hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis is simpler. Sumer inherited as much as it invented. The beings remembered as gods were human survivors of an earlier civilization destroyed by climate catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age. They carried knowledge, astronomical tables, mathematical systems, agricultural techniques, architectural principles, and perhaps most importantly, the understanding that knowledge must be preserved deliberately or it will be lost. When these survivors encountered Neolithic populations in Mesopotamia, they became teachers, organizers, the founding elite of what would become Sumerian civilization. Their knowledge, combined with local innovation, produced the sudden fluorescence we see in the archaeological record. Over generations, the survivors themselves faded through death, assimilation, or dispersion. But their systems remained, encoded in clay tablets, institutionalized in temple schools, embedded in the structure of Sumerian society. The people became myths. The myths became gods. But the knowledge survived. We still use their knowledge. And we are still living with that knowledge. When you check the time, you're using Sumerian BASC 60 division of hours and minutes. When you measure an angle, you're using their 360-degree circle. When you track the planets, you're following observational traditions that trace back through Babylon to Sumer to something older still. Our foundational myths, flood narratives, divine teachers, golden ages before catastrophe echo the same stories the Sumerians told. Perhaps because those stories preserve genuine memory of a world that ended and a recovery that began. Are we the first? We think of ourselves as the pinnacle of human achievement, the first civilization to truly understand the cosmos and organize society rationally. But what if we're not the first? What if we're the latest in a cycle of remembering and forgetting, building and losing, rising and falling that stretches back further than our history's record? The clay tablets whisper this possibility. They were made by people who had seen knowledge lost and were desperate to prevent it from happening again. They succeeded, partially. Enough fragments survived that we can glimpse what came before. But even their heroic preservation effort saved only pieces of a larger whole. How much more has been lost that we don't even know to look for? The real identity of Sumer's gods. The gods of Sumer weren't supernatural beings from another realm. They were us. Or at least, they were human people who survived catastrophe, people who carried forward what they could salvage from a dying world, people who taught the next generation how to rebuild, knowing they themselves would not live to see the full restoration. They were a distant family from a world that drowned, trying across the gulf of time to tell us, this has happened before. Civilization's full. Knowledge is fragile. Pay attention. Remember.